During this demonstration, I will present to you the pair of web portals that are part of the Anjana platform. Initially, we will enter the data portal functioning as the primary entrance to the comprehensive list of all governed assets at our disposal. On the other hand, we'll explore the configuration management portal, which enables us to continuously evolve and adapt the Anjana configuration whenever needed. In other words, this means modifying the operational model for roles, permissions, and validation workflows, as well as the meta model associated with the different types of governed objects, templates, attribute types, validations, taxonomies, lineage layers, and more. Now, let's access the data portal where we can see one of the platform's key capabilities, the integration between Anjana data and our platforms, which in this case is the ability to integrate with identity management systems so that users can authenticate using their corporate credentials. We can see that Anjana can integrate with corporate LDAP systems as well as with the different identity management systems used by each organization. Once we access the portal, we land on a personalized view based on the roles assigned to each user. When I enter the portal, I can immediately see the different artificial intelligence models that I'm responsible for according to my role. When we go into the user profile section, we can see the roles assigned to each person within the operational model, one of the first things configured during the setup process. In Anjana data is precisely the definition of the operational model based on domains, meaning the different stewardship and responsibility areas. Within our organization, we may have different domains such as finance data, supplier data, customer data, human resources data, and so on. So in Anjana, we will be able to configure those different data domains, which in Anjana are referred to as organizational units, and each person can take on one or more roles within each of those domains. Some of these roles may be transversal roles, such as the data architect role we are seeing here, while others may be more domain-specific or vertical roles. For example, I may act as a data consumer within the UK finance data domain, while in the Spain finance domain, I may instead have a role with management responsibilities. Regardless of the operating model, whether centralized, decentralized, hybrid, or federated, we can configure it within Anjana data by customizing those data domains, the roles and permissions assigned to each role so users can perform the activities they are responsible for based on their day-to-day responsibilities. We can assign permissions to perform different actions on different types of assets, such as creating datasets, creating or modifying business terms, or sending them for validation. We can also allow or restrict access to the different modules available within the platform. This means that access to specific modules does not necessarily depend on acquiring separate licenses. Instead, access to certain modules can be restricted based on user roles. What modules are available within the platform? For example, we have a creation wizard that allows us to register new entities either through manual creation, through Excel-based data uploads, or through metadata extraction from source systems. There is also a module that we refer to as the Jobs module. This module allows us to monitor all bulk imports performed through Excel files, as well as discovery processes executed through plugins. We can track how many assets have been imported, how many are still in progress, and whether any errors occurred during the loading process. It also supports large-scale operations such as metadata editing, validation workflows, and other processes that can all be monitored from this Jobs module. There is also a lineage module where we can visualize not only the life cycle of the data from a technical perspective, meaning the different data sources, the ETL processes responsible for loading the information, for example, into a data lake, and how that information is later propagated into one or more data marts for analytics purposes, but we can also visualize the full lineage connected to the business domain, allowing us to understand the meaning of each data element through business concepts and how it relates to reports, metrics, KPIs, and other business artifacts. We can also visualize the lineage associated with data consumption, including which consumers and which users have access to specific data assets through different data sharing agreements. There is also a workflows module to which we can grant or restrict access for different roles, where we can visualize responsibility matrices and RICE matrices that define who is accountable, who is responsible, who is consulted, and who is informed for specific actions, as all these participants take part in the validation workflows through a BPM engine. This ensures that every governance-related action goes through the corresponding validation workflows, with different roles supervising and validating that the entire governance procedure is properly enforced. On the other hand, we also have an audit module where we can visualize the full governance trace, including what happens from a governance perspective, who created a dataset, who submitted it for validation, and who approved its creation, who validated subsequent changes to the structure, the fields, the number of fields, or even the length of a field. All of this is fully traceable within the platform. In addition, this audit module also incorporates data observability information, such as what is happening across the data platforms, which ETL processes have been executed, how long they took, how many records were created, and how many were updated. All the information related to what is happening across the data platforms can be pushed into Anjana through the audit module, allowing us to combine execution metadata with the declarative metadata associated with the templates. In addition, starting with version 25.1 of Anjana, each user will have their own personal workspace, where users will be able to add different assets into their personal working environment in order to work with those assets. Users will be able to perform actions ranging from re-importing metadata through Excel, to downloading information, sending bulk notifications by email, or executing mass metadata updates, and so on. Continuing with permissions, Anjana Data can also operate as a data marketplace. This allows users with the appropriate permissions to access a shopping cart interface where they can add the information assets and data assets they want to consume in order to request governed access to them. In other words, through the signing of a data sharing agreement, through the acceptance of a contract defining which uses of the information are allowed and which are restricted, and through a validation workflow designed to guarantee data sovereignty. As you can see, we are always talking about a highly collaborative governance model. We've talked about validation workflows, roles, access requests, and data sovereignty. So, the way different roles interact with each other is through validation workflows that trigger different notifications for different types of users, through the notifications panel as well as via email. Users can receive different types of notifications. Alerts, which are messages related to situations where a role needs to participate in a validation action. For example, if someone requests access to data assets that are under my custody, I will receive an alert indicating that I need to participate in the validation process. On the other hand, there are the notices, which are messages related to information that may be relevant to us. For example, if I have launched an access request to a report and my request has been rejected, well, I will receive a notice notifying of the rejection and the reasons why they have rejected my request. And then for those users who are administrators, they will also receive in this notification panel alerts related to the administration of the platform. Configuration errors, plugins that are not working properly, users that are not working, etc. And notice, one of the features that the platform also has is that it supports multilingualism. That is to say that users can select in their profile the language in which they wish to consume the platform's information, not only at the level of usability of the platform, but we will also be able to see that the metadata attribute templates can contain information in different languages. Well, once we have our operating model configured, the entire platform will govern its behavior by that model that we have defined within our organization. How do we use the platform? Let's start with an imaginary situation in which we already have a series of governed assets. And what happens? Well, that normally users, the different users, both business users and technical users, well, many times we need to locate information to perform activities of our day-to-day. It could be, for instance, consulting what each of the metrics or KPIs that we are seeing in a report means for decision making. Or I can be, for example, a data scientist who is looking for data to train the models, or a user who wants to access certain raw information to create their own report. In any case, the answer always has to be in our portal. In our data portal, we have a search engine that will allow us to locate the information we are looking for. For instance, I need information on sales. And once I enter into the search engine that I am looking for sales information, besides the search engine, I have filters to help me locate the information because I am receiving different asset types here. We see that we are finding, well, information directly in the form of data sets, that is, tables, files that have sales information. For example, here we are seeing a metric, we are seeing fields of those tables. We are seeing, for example, Power BI reports. We are seeing different types of assets that are governed in the portal and that obeys this search in which we look for sales information. Obviously, with so much information, it is hard to decide. Therefore, we will use the filters. What are we looking for? Well, for instance, we look for tables, or for example, we look for reports. That is information that has already been processed. Do you see that the search results are changing? Also, well, I evidently am looking for sales information. Therefore, the most reputable people would be the sales and marketing department. Furthermore, I only want what is already governed. And furthermore, probably with a certain level of governance. I have no use for information that is not reputable. So I'll look for information with a high level of governance, a gold level. Additionally, since I already have several results here, I could consult each one of them. But let's add some filter that helps us a little bit more to locate what we are looking for. Let us look for information that is in a technology that I know that I can consult easily. Also, I'm interested in information I can use. I am not going to go to confidential information of a department, so let's apply those filters. For example, I am going to look for data that is inside the data lake and that I can use at an integral level. Do you see that by applying both the filters that the portal gives me and the filters that I can add additionally, I have managed to narrow down the searches quite a bit, what we're looking for. Actually, if this search seemed interesting, I could even save these filters so that they would appear here as we have seen before. Before, when we entered with my favorite filter, the one I had marked, and I can add different filters that allow me to use the searches, or rather reuse searches that I do frequently and that I find useful. Returning to the search, we have found different datasets that have elements that may interest us. And notice that each one is in approved status. Since we filtered by approved status, this is logical to happen like that. What is the asset governance process? How do assets come to be approved and verified? Well, very simple. When we start to govern, usually governance is passive in an organization. Meaning, when we start from scratch, we take a connector for different technologies, like an Oracle connector, an Azure storage connector, an AWS S3, a node, etc., etc. Well, we take the connector, we scan a certain database, and we import the information to the portal. Why do I say import? Because when we scan, the assets we govern and incorporate into the portal appear here as imported. What does imported status mean? That it only contains technical metadata, that is, what we can recover from the technologies. For example, in the case of Node, we can recover the name of the views, the fields, field type, length, precision, security tags, etc. But all that information, which is usually very valuable, like functional information, governance information, who is responsible, the data owner, the data steward, how often audits are done, audit results, if it has personal data, and so on. Usually that information isn't in technology catalogs. Therefore, that information does not appear in the templates that we are going to see next when the object is in imported status. That information is usually information that we people have in mind, the people who work with the assets. So, when the responsible people start to dump our knowledge into the templates, the assets go from imported status to draft status and remain that way while we are working on the contextualization of the asset. Once we finish, usually what is done is to launch one of those validation flows that we mentioned before so that the asset is supervised for metadata quality, completeness, etc. etc. While it is under review during the workflow, it appears here in pending status. It remains pending while all the validators do the review. If everything goes well within the validation process, the asset will remain, as we are seeing here, in approved status. And if someone sees an error, it will be rejected. In the workflow, the rejection comments will remain, and here it will appear in rejected status so that we can apply the changes until we finally manage to get it in approved status. What can happen? Well, it can happen that these assets that are currently on the data platforms undergo, for example, a structure modification or a migration to another technology. And when these things happen, we will usually want to do an impact control through versioning, not the capabilities that Anjana has as part of its proactive and preventive governance philosophy. So what would happen? Well, that an asset in approved status would pass to deprecated status as a transitory version that warns of changes that are going to be put into production soon. And the moment it is put into production, the asset would pass from deprecated status to expired status, so that there would be a record that at some point that version has been a valid version. And this is the way in which we control the life cycle of the governance of the assets within Anjana. Let's navigate to the detail of one of these assets. And we land on the metadata attributes template. As Dama says, you cannot be data-driven if you are not metadata-driven first. Therefore, the first thing presented to the user is a metadata attributes template. These templates are defined by the users, that is, each organization defines the menus, the sections, and what attributes will appear within each of the sections. Every organization, as I say, defines how many menus it wants, how many sections, what they are called, and the information for each section so users understand it better, and which metadata attributes it requires, their names, and even the help messages. Everything is fully customizable. What does Anjana offer? It provides this full customization capacity and various attribute types. For instance, we see that the name is a text attribute. For example, the domain is a list of taxonomies containing different values. We see, for example, that the governance level is an attribute that has images and text. We see, for example, attributes with rich text, user type attributes, booleans. We see, for example, around here also what other little things we have. Well, entity type attributes. Well, as we see, we have different types of attributes. Files, numeric roots, decimals, and so forth. The goal is for each of the organizations to create their own templates on which they will also be able to add validations. Validations that, on one hand, will contribute to a higher quality of the metadata, and also to the fulfillment of certain policies. For example, we can make certain attributes mandatory so that no one can send them to be validated if the information has not been filled in beforehand. Or as, for example, we are seeing here, well, a dataset is categorized as having sensitive or personal information if any of the fields in this table that we are going to see in a few minutes, well, is marked as having personal data. Why? Because it says this information is inheritable. I cannot select it. It is directly inherited from the information we will see in the tab for structure. If we go to the Structure tab, we will see that in this case, since it is a structured dataset, it has a structure of fields where we are going to see the different columns a description for each of them, the position, the physical name, the data type, and so on. And if from here we want to navigate to any of the templates, well, we just have to click and we will see, well, again, a totally customized template and in fact, different from the one we have seen for dataset. This is a smaller template that has functional information, technical information, and information about data profiling. If we return to the dataset and keep moving forward, we will arrive at the Relationships tab. At this point, we already see that the dataset does not live isolated within that data ecosystem, but that it relates to other elements of our data ecosystem. In this case, we will be able to navigate and consult both direct and indirect relationships, as well as composition ones. What are direct relationships? They are relationships between the dataset and other elements of the informational ecosystem. For example, here we see a relationship with a report. That is, this Power BI report, well, is pulling the information it shows in each of its KPIs, well, from that dataset that we were seeing a minute ago. Upon landing on the template, we see again that it is a different template with other information, with other menus, sections, and other attributes, different from those seen for datasets and dataset builds. Thanks to this template, we can consult what exists in our organization, such as a report reflecting monthly sales. What is the purpose for which this report was created? The audience. What are each of the metrics? And in fact, we could navigate to see, well, how they are calculated. What filters are applied to the data, start dates, end dates, whatever is appropriate, how often this information is updated. Well, we can see. We can even have a link to navigate directly to Power BI and consult this report, provided we have access to it within Power BI. Report. Actually, if we did not have access, we could come here, add it to the shopping cart, and from here, request access through that marketplace that allows us to create Anjana. If we continue consulting the dataset information and want to consult what are the relationships it has indirectly, that is to say, what relationships exist between some of its fields and other elements in our informational ecosystem, we will see the typical foreign key relationship between the products table and the monthly sales table. Through the product identifier, we can relate both tables. And from the Composition Relationships tab, we can see if there is any data sharing agreement, any data set in agreement that is going to allow me to request access to the information contained within this data set. In this case, we see that there are two data sets. One of them is expiring, two data sets in agreement, one of which is expired, but there is a new version of that same data set in agreement that is approved, and therefore we will be able to request access to the information. If we navigate, we consult all information about that data sharing agreement. Among it, well, we will be able to see to which entities it would give me access in case I adhered to that data set in agreement, the sensitivity of the data I will access, or the data contract I must sign. But as it is something that we will do later, we are going to leave it for in a few minutes. We return to the dataset, and in this case, we are going to consult the lineage. As we have commented before, the lineage is going to allow us not only to have a technical vision, but also we can have a vision more attached to the business world or even to the consumption of the data. Within Anjana, we are going to be able to configure different layers that offer different views to the users. And in an exploratory way, we are going to be able to consult all of those relationships. Naturally, each one of these layers is going to pre-filter the information that we are seeing. For example, within this layer, we can see day models, data sets, data products, reports, among other types of assets. We are going to enable the centering option so we don't get dizzy, and we will start to explore those relationships. And we start to explore relationships we already know, such as, for example, what are the fields that this data set has? Well, we had already seen them before in the Structure tab. If we want to know how the information has arrived at this data set that we had seen before was inside the data lake corporate, we'll see the internal relationships. And here we see that there is an ETL process that is bringing information from the ERP, loading it into two of those data sets that are inside the data lake, monthly sales and gross margin. But also from here, we see that there are other ETL processes running like all these here, which is to bring information from the different sources, that is to say, not only from the ERP, but also from an inventory control system, a support tool, a survey tool. We have different data sources, and through different ETL processes, the information is being taken to different data sets within the data lake. If we keep moving forward to know more relationships, we will be able to see something we already knew, right? That there is a sales report that has a series of metrics, and that the information from which the sales report is nourished, well, they are these two tables that we had already seen within the template. But also, we will be able to navigate because we see here that there are other relationships. Let's unfold all metric relationships. And we see here, for example, we are going to enable the capacity to move things within the lineage. We see here that there are two concepts of business that are related to the metrics. On one hand, the concept of sale that the financial team has, and on the other hand, the concept of sale that the commercial team has. Personally, I as a user would worry that within the same report, there are being used two different sales concepts, because it is possible that the data do not match. There are data inconsistencies between these two metrics, and this is due precisely to a difference in definition. In fact, we are going to disable the movement. We are going to navigate to know what is that financial concept of sale. From the description, we will understand what the sales concept means for the financial team, and in fact, someone has taken the trouble to tell us what are the differences between the concept of sale that the commercial area has and the one that the financial area has. This can result very useful for us to understand the information of those metrics that we are seeing within the report. The life cycle doesn't end there. We see that here there is a little process that is doing a cleaning and remediation of the data and is bringing the information from the different tables to tables that already have the label that they have been cleaned. I meant tables, datasets, files. All data from these datasets goes to a process that does is divide the data. Divide the data into training data and test data. With the training data, well, we can imagine that the training data serve to pass the information through different models to have some results for different algorithms of the same model to obtain a series of results. And from these results, well, we will have trained. We'll have a trained model, which will give us some results for all those test data. And thanks to this, well, we will have obtained a recommendation model that, according to the new European regulation, well, we have the obligation to catalog. And also, on the other hand, do a risk assessment according to the taxonomies that the European Union marks. Thanks to the configuration capabilities of these templates, we can do an integral governance of the models. We can have that categorization of the models that allows us to understand, well, at a functional level, what the data means. What is the level of risk according to the taxonomy that the European Union establishes? Who are the responsible roles? Well, who is in charge of the model? Who is responsible for ethics? Who is responsible for security, for development, etc.? If any type of additional approval is required within the validation workflow, what security mechanisms are used, or for example, something very interesting, well, what are the data that are used both for training and what are the data that are then processed This is fundamental because if in the risk analysis we identify that biases are applied, etc., well, not only will we have to take remediation measures for what the model is, but it is also possible that those biases, well, are in the data from which the model is nourished. Therefore, it is fundamental to have the integral governance of our models. All this we have analyzed from a layer that would allow us to obtain the global vision. So what interests me is how the information is consumed. I can change the layer. The information that is shown to me is different, and from here we are going to be able to see which users have access to the dataset information because they have signed, they have adhered to a data sharing agreement, and in fact these people not only have access to the table or sales dataset, but they also have access to the report with various different metrics that allow us to make informed business decisions. If we continue moving forward, one of the things that is also extremely useful for data governance is precisely knowing which people have a role of responsibility in case we detect quality problems, a lack of data, or any other issue. We will want to contact those responsible. From here, we will be able to consult who the different stakeholders are to know, for example, what role a specific person has, or who the data owner is, Alberto, and who the data steward is. We see it is Francisco, or even which individuals are joined and have access because they have signed that data sharing agreement and their request has been approved. If we notice, these people are the ones we already saw in the lineage that had access because they were joined to the data sharing agreement that we had previously seen. As we mentioned at the start, a very important part of data governance is also having control over what has happened from the historical trace, not only from the governance point of view, that is, what has happened from the governance point of view. For example, if we filter by date and extract the Anjana audit, we will be able to see that it was my user who on October 9th, 2024, performed a creation through a massive import in Excel. In fact, I used a functionality that Excel itself has, which is send to validate, and that Alberto was the one who participated in the approval of this dataset. Right after getting Alberto's approval, the workflow was successfully completed with an approved status. Here is the historical trace of what happened from a governance perspective, but I might be interested in knowing what is happening from the point of view of auditing, of observability, what is happening in the data platforms. And thanks to this, I can see, for example, when the last incremental load process finished, how long it took, how many records it has currently updated, or which people are launching a series of queries because they have access to the information. In fact, a very good exercise would be to compare if these people who are running queries are people who appear as joined within the Stakeholders tab. Because if that is not the case, surely they may discover a way to access information through a backdoor, but the convenience lies in their compliance with the data sharing agreement, which governs these accesses. When we spoke about the asset lifecycle flow, the different states, from imported until an asset ends up in an approved state, we noted that once the process of governance is established and certain assets are under governance, we might be interested in performing an impact control through versioning rules. Anjana allows you that when we make certain changes, whether it be in the structure of the fields or in the attribute template itself, we generate new versions of an object. In this case, Esperataset only has one version, version 0, which is in an approved state. But if we include an extra field into the structure, delete an existing field, adjust the sensitivity, length, or precision of any field, and make other modifications as necessary. In this setting, we have set up all circumstances to activate versioning, as we aim to maintain control over the effects caused by impactful changes, both from the security perspective and from the perspective of technical incompatibilities. Therefore, should I attempt to make any modifications to this object while it is in an authorized state, a new version would be generated, a version 1, and all those objects that we have seen in the lineage that would be related to this asset. Each of the responsible parties would be notified of the existence of a new version so that we can perform that impact control. Actually, if we version this dataset, as it is contained in a data sharing agreement, in a dataset in agreement, the users, to continue having access to the new version, would have to join to a new dataset in agreement that contained the new version. Otherwise, they would lose access the moment the dataset passed to an expired state. And finally, we are going to consult a sample of the information. Until now, all the information we had seen was metadata, and here what we are seeing is the content of the dataset. For the first time that we are seeing a sample of the data. Here we are seeing values that the sale ID field or product ID has, etc., etc. All these data we are seeing in clear because in the Structures tab, none of the fields was marked as being personal data. If any of them were marked as such, the data would appear here obfuscated. They would appear with asterisks so that we would not see sensitive or personal data. So far, we have completed a discovery phase and utilized the data portal to access the necessary sales information. This process has been crucial for our research work. We have obtained a series of results. We have consulted this one that seemed interesting, and we have seen the attribute template, the structure, the relationships, the lineage, the responsible parties, all the audit, the version history, even a small data sample. Imagine we want to request access to this data. I just have to come here and add it to the shopping cart. Once in the shopping cart, we are going to do a data purchase process. Just like shopping online, it feels like browsing an e-commerce site. We have several different assets here that we would like to request access to. As we observe, a number of them show a notification indicating the absence of a data sharing agreement, leading to our inability to request access to those resources. Even though we are able to request the responsible party to please create a data sharing agreement so that we may request access to them. We would like to propose sending a message to suggest the creation of a data sharing agreement. This agreement should include a contract that allows us to have regulated access to the data. Regarding the other assets we have added, the sales report and the sales rate, we can see that green message indicating we can request access. And Anjana shows us all the possible combinations of data sharing agreements that are currently available. In this case, there is only one data sharing agreement, which is the one we are seeing here, that we have seen in the lineage. And it has a data contract associated with it. As a user, we are going to download the data sharing agreement and read it to see if we are interested and if it is suitable for the use we want to carry out. From this point, we will be able to see what the specific terms and conditions of the access contract are. Just like any agreement, it consists of two sections. The producer's commitments include ensuring quality standards and regularly updating information. This involves guaranteeing certain levels of quality and updating information with a specific frequency, have the mechanisms that ensure the truthfulness and the consistency of the data, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, the consumer who is going to have access to the information also has their own commitments. They commit to making an appropriate use and not to share the information with external parties. To have a series of security and data protection mechanisms, not to download the information to a pen drive and lose it, and so on. And if we are in agreement, we are going to sign that data sharing agreement. In order to accomplish this, all we need to do is just sign and explain the reason for wanting access. For this instance, access is necessary as we are showcasing the new version through a demonstration. And this is the message we are going to send to the owner. If you all remember, we saw within the profile that my user had several different roles. It does not make sense for me to launch the request with my responsibility role, or as an Anjana administrator, I am going to do it with my consumer role. We launch the request, and we see that notification indicating that a validation workflow has already been launched, and we see that the workflow we just launched is waiting for validation. Validation from whom? In this case, from the data owner. If we recall, we observed it listed under the stakeholders section. The data owner was Alberto. So we are going to log in using the user account of Alberto. And we see that Alberto has received a notification. To be specific, he has just received an alert, and now we can see the message we left. I require access as I am conducting a demonstration of the updated version of the Anjana data platform from this point onwards. We are going to want to navigate to the data. From here, we will be able, with Alberto's role, with Alberto's user, to approve or reject the request Lucia made. In this case, we are going to approve it. And the message that we are going to leave is the one that remains tracked as part of the audit of Anjana. We see that in this case, the workflow has finished with an approved status because the only stakeholder was Alberto, and therefore, from this moment on, Lucia would already have access. Let's head to the admin panel for take a look at how this validation flow is and how it has been configured. From this point, from the configuration panel, we will utilize all the configuration features available within the platform to their full extent. We have seen that we could govern different types of assets, that we can, within what is the operating model, define different roles, such as data owner, data steward, and data consumer in various roles and responsibilities. In addition, we can give different permissions to each of the roles, from creation permissions, deprecation, organizational unit change. We can also create variants of attributes include text type attributes, identities, selectors, and other types that are utilized in different contexts. In the administrators panel, we also have a business process management system, BPM, which is what allows us to configure the validation workflows. In this case, the workflow we launched was an adherence workflow by which the data owner received a notification and decided if they approved or rejected it. And in either case, we notified the user of our decision. Well, this is the workflow that has been executed within Anjana. And we are going to see that adherence process that we were looking at a few minutes ago. Well, within the workflow, we have seen that we have finished with an approved status and that therefore Lucia would already have access. Why does Lucia have access? It all started with the data sharing agreement we established earlier. How did she obtain it? This goes back to when we first set up the agreement. When we created this data sharing agreement that gives access to 2 datasets and a report, upon being validated and reaching approved status through the validation process, when it was approved, what happened is that 2 of the Anjana plugins, at least 2, because we see that these are the same technology, Azure Storage, and this is a Power BI report, well, several plugins have been activated. In this case, 3. Those that integrate with identity management systems to create a group within that identity management system. That group is represented by the data sharing agreement and a role in these technologies in Azure Storage and in Power BI. So that once we have already created the group and the role in the technologies, each time a user requests access through a signed data agreement or their request reaches an approved status, it follows the adherence process we previously reviewed. Once more, the plugins are triggered to capture that person's user profile and include them in the group that represented the data sharing agreement. That is how Anjana handles all access permissions in an automatic fashion. We are going to log in once more using Lucia's user account to see how that process works of governance. We started from a situation where there were already a series of governed assets, but how do we get to govern? Well, obviously, I must have a role with permissions to access this creation wizard. And here I will be able to see the different assets, for which I hold permissions through my various roles. Well, I have permissions for creation. We have the ability to develop a wide range of solutions, from data processing to meet GDPR requirements, to artificial intelligence models to ensure compliance with IAAG regulations. data sets, metrics, analytics, information products, business terminology, all of those assets that are relevant from the perspective of data governance. When selecting an asset category, such as managing diverse datasets, various choices are available to govern them effectively. Starting with manual creation, where I fill out an empty template and create one from scratch to load all the necessary information. I can also choose to import an Excel spreadsheet document if needed. I download a template to create, say, 100 datasets of each of its fields of its feeds. I download the template and we can see that the template includes the typical README file that helps us fill in the information we will see next. In the first row, you will find a list of menus, while the second row includes the sections, functional, governance, and security, which were previously discussed in Anjana. These sections are of critical importance. And from here, we can give different names. Select the various domains for each of those specific tables, the level of governance, etc., etc. The same for the dataset fields. And from here, we can also use the option of direct submission for validation. Hence, we carefully choose the specific role we wish to use for initiating the validation process in order to trigger all governance activities during the loading phase. Once the file is completed, the only thing left to do is to upload it to perform that bulk load. And the third option is automatic metadata extraction. So what we are going to do here is a discovery. We are going to select which data we are looking at and where the data we want to scan is located. We will now select technology, data lake stories, the gold layer. And we will see. For example, we are going to import the candidate information, and this we are going to say that it belongs to the human resources unit. We are going to scan. A job name will be assigned by us. And this will take us to the Jobs tab to see that the information from this table has already been imported, as we can see here in the imported status. And from the Jobs module, we will have a trace of all the actions that are currently being performed. For example, we see here this discovery that we have just performed just a moment ago. And from here, we navigate to see the content, all that metadata that we have brought from the technology. For example, what is the physical path, or what are, well, the different fields together with their length, precision, physical name information, etc.